So I'd like to do a book review for a book I just picked up recently. It's a fascinating read. It's called The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind. It was written by Gustave Le Bon. Now, he was a French polymath whose areas of interest were psychology, sociology, medicine, etc. He was born in 1841 and he died in 1931. So, the book The Crowd was written in 1895, and that's going to be important moving forward in this review. Many of the things he said, he had an eerie level of prescience in what he claimed the outcome of all of this would be. Keep that in mind as we go further. It's also worth noting that this book and his other works influenced many figures over the last century, including Sigmund Freud, Benito Mussolini, and a plethora of other influential figures. So Le Bon begins by describing what he calls the era of crowds. He says that we're now entering that era, and to the reader it will be most obvious that he was right in his assertion, as we are now on the other side of that statement. Says Le Bon, quote, "Little adapted to reasoning, crowds, on the contrary, are quick to act. As a result of their present organization, their strength has become immense. The dogmas whose birth we are witnessing will soon have the force of the old dogmas. That is to say, the tyrannical and sovereign force of being above discussion. The divine right of the masses is about to replace the divine right of kings." Unquote. So most people think of a crowd and imagine that it's a massive numerical gathering of pernicious criminal men, but Gustave Le Bon disagrees with this. He says, at least in the psychological sense, that a crowd is, and I'm quoting, "In its ordinary sense of the word, crowd means a gathering of individuals of whatever nationality, profession, or sex, and whatever be the chances that have brought them together. From the psychological point of view, the expression crowd assumes quite a different signification. Under certain given circumstances, and only under those circumstances, an agglomeration of men presents new characteristics very different from those of individuals composing it. The sentiments and ideas of all the persons in the crowd take one and the same direction, and their conscious personality vanishes. A collective mind is formed, doubtless transitory, but presenting very clearly defined characteristics." Unquote. Now Gustave Le Bon goes on to add, quote, "It is evident that it is not by the mere fact of a number of individuals finding themselves accidentally side by side that they acquire the character of an organized crowd. 1,000 individuals accidentally gathered in a public space without any determined object in no way constitute a crowd from the psychological point of view. To acquire the special characteristics of such a crowd, the influence is necessary of certain predisposing causes, of which we shall have to determine the nature." Unquote. So, Gustave Le Bon believes there are 5 major remote factors that make up the beliefs that a crowd of any kind will hold. Number 1 is race, which he affirms is by far the most important. I'm not going to touch on it here, though. We'll get to that loosely shortly. The second remote factor he speaks of is traditions, which represent the ideas and sentiments of the past. The third factor is time, which he calls the sole real creator and the sole real destroyer. The fourth factor is politics and social institutions. He says it's a grave delusion that progress be measured by the improvement of governments and institutions. He goes on to discuss how, with futility, philosophers of the past have tried to disprove this absurd notion, to no avail. The fifth remote factor that he speaks of regarding crowds and the ideas they'll hold is their instruction and education. So this is the one I'm going to spend a little more time on than the others. He says that among the dominant ideas is that with instruction will change a man and make him equal to another. He says this idea is false. He believes that the assertion is repeated so often that it is among the most steadfast of democratic dogma, comparing it to the futility of attempting to attack church dogma in former times. Le Bon mentions the philosopher Herbert Spencer and how he had no difficulty in showing that a man did not become moral due to becoming educated. Le Bon states that most of education, and what he sardonically calls learning, is just memorization of books and the recitation of the contents therein. He continues with a scrupulous attack against academia itself, and laments the amount of time a young man spends wasting away in such institutions while not really learning anything of substance. He goes on to mention that a period of darkness is encroaching because of the socialism and anarchism that is taught in classrooms of academia. A very noteworthy observation the author makes is the section on images, words, and formulas. Le Bon discusses in this section how it's possible to evoke images and impressions into the crowds by the use of words and formulas. He says that the vaguer the words used, the more power they will hold. Words like democracy, socialism, liberty, equality, etc. These terms are so vaguely defined that they're able to be used almost like a spell being cast on the minds of the crowd. Le Bon makes a really powerful point here about language itself and the way that words change over time. This is something that a statesman will almost certainly need to leverage in order to control the crowd. Think of the way the words like racist and evil have changed over time, as I read what he says on the matter. Quote, "Numerous are the words whose meaning has thus profoundly changed from age to age. Words which we can only arrive at understanding in the sense in which they were formerly understood. After a long effort, it has been said with truth that much study is necessary merely to arrive at conceiving what was signified to our great-grandfathers by such words as the king and the royal family. What then is likely to be the case with terms still more complex? Words then have only mobile and transitory significations, which change from age to age and people to people, and when we desire to exert an influence by their means in the crowd, what it is requisite to know is the meaning given them by the crowd at a given moment, and not the meaning which they formerly had or may yet have for individuals of a different mental constitution. Thus, when crowds have come, as the result of political upheavals or changes of belief, to acquire a profound antipathy for the images evoked by certain words, the first duty of the true statesman is to change the words, without, of course, laying hands on the things themselves, the latter being too intimately bound up with the inherited constitution to be transformed." Unquote. So I found it quite ironic after reading this that even the way Le Bon uses the word race in this book is very different than we do in the modern day. He uses it to speak closer to what we would see as an ethnic group, which drives his point home quite well. Interesting to note is how Le Bon sees that words are baptized and given new life. This is to sidestep crowds' wrath or to steer them in a new direction, like a creature that has a hook in its snout and is yanked by a master that it cannot see. So things like global warming become global boiling, for instance, or a central bank becomes the Federal Reserve, so on and so forth. The baptism of language and words has without a doubt been scrupulously used against the people of the world from ancient times to the modern day. Le Bon writes about affirmation, repetition, and what he calls contagion. These are the formulas that leaders employ to perniciously control and dominate the crowds. Worth noting here is that the leaders of crowds who employ this method, as a general rule, must hold a high level of prestige. We'll get to that later, though. For now, let's look at what Gustave said about this formula. Affirmation. Affirmation, kept free of reasoning and evidence, is one of the surest means of making an idea enter the mind of a crowd, according to Le Bon. The conciser it is, the better. However, without being constantly repeated, the affirmation will not hold influence. He follows up affirmation with repetition. It is through repetition that the thing affirmed will integrate itself into the mind of its hearers. Napoleon said, for instance, that the only figure in rhetoric of serious importance is repetition. Think of advertisements, the amount of money that changes hands through marketing firms. It's clear that repetition works. He follows this up with contagion. So, sentiments and ideas in crowds possess a contagious power. Much like a mind virus, memes in the modern day demonstrate this perfectly. An example that Le Bon gives to demonstrate the contagion of a crowd is how one animal will panic and very rapidly the entire flock becomes seized with terror. Imitation, especially in the age of social media and the age of the online influencer, is a form of contagion. Think Twitter, or X as it's called now. After reading this section, you can see the formula in use by our overlords in the last few years. Just think about how often you hear slogans such as these. Slogans like, "Trust the science," or "Make America Great Again," or "This is a threat to our democracy," or "The science is settled." Notice how these affirmations are enforced through repetition and then spread like the contagion they are. Once these magical slogans are uttered, rational thought and reason are thrown to the wayside. Contagion kicks in. As Le Bon states multiple times, the crowd has minimal ability to reason, and these slogans are intentionally vague so as to hold 50 different meanings to 50 different people who might say them. This brings us to the section on prestige. Now, prestige is the defining trait in those who lead crowds. Le Bon states that prestige is the resulting power that time synthesizes when affirmation, repetition, and contagion are employed, resulting in a domination exercised on our minds by an individual or an idea. When prestige is exercised, the critical faculties fail and are replaced with awe and fascination. Le Bon says that the two main types of prestige are the personal kind and the acquired kind. Acquired prestige is a result of fame, name, and reputation, whereas personal prestige is something peculiar to the individual. These two types can coexist within an individual, however. They are not exclusive. Reading this section, I thought to myself for a while about the number of times I've personally witnessed prestige rob a man of reason. For instance, pastors, academics, especially social media influencers, will blind their hearers from seeing things as they truly are. This is chiefly to the prestige that they wield as a sword and shield against any who might dare to criticize them. Think of the big dog that submits to the dog one-third its size. You'll get an idea of how prestige grants the one who possesses it unfathomable powers. Though the big dog clearly possesses the power to dominate the smaller one to his will, he appears to be bound by an invisible force. It is this force that we recognize as prestige when we scale this example up, from 2 dogs to 200 dogs, for instance. I'm only scratching the surface of this book. It's evident to me that many of his predictions were right, and the grim reality that he saw looking ahead has come to pass. I highly recommend this book to anybody with even a trace amount of curiosity about why the masses seem to get placed under this spell that causes them to accept the most absurd notions as absolute truth. There is absolutely something in this work for everybody. I'm going to end this review, though, with Le Bon's final 2 pages, in which he terminates his work by a brief aside on the decline of civilization. Keep in mind as I'm reading this that this was a man writing in 1895. After having exerted its creative action, time begins that work of destruction from which neither gods nor men escape. Having reached a certain level of strength and complexity, a civilization ceases to grow, and having ceased to grow, it is condemned to a speedy decline. The hour of its old age has struck. The inevitable hour is always marked by the weakening of the ideal that was the mainstay of the race. In proportion as this ideal pales, all the religious, political, and social structures inspired by it begin to be shaken. With the progressive perishing of its ideal, the race loses more and more of the qualities that lent it its cohesion, its unity, and its strength. The personality and intelligence of the individual may increase, but at the same time, this collective egoism of the race is replaced by an excessive development of the egoism of the individual, accompanied by a weakening of the character and a lessening of the capacity for action. What constituted a people, a unity, a whole, becomes in the end an agglomeration of individualities lacking cohesion and artificially held together for a time by its traditions and institutions. It is at this stage that men, divided by their interests and aspirations, and incapable any longer of self-government, require directing in their pettiest acts, and that the state exerts an absorbing influence. With the definite loss of its old ideal, the genius of the race entirely disappears. It is a mere swarm of isolated individuals and returns to its original state, that of a crowd. Without consistency and without a future, it has all the transitory characteristics of crowds. Its civilization is now without stability and at the mercy of every chance. The populace is sovereign, and the tide of barbarism mounts. The civilization may still seem brilliant because it possesses an outward front, the work of a long past, but it is in reality an edifice, crumbling to ruin, which nothing supports, and destined to fall at the first storm. To pass in pursuit of an ideal from the barbarous to the civilized state, and then, when this ideal has lost its virtue, to decline and die. Such is the life cycle of a people.